Hello, I'm Jim Halfpenny, and I welcome you to a Gathering of Naturalists. The gathering is hosted by a Naturalist World, an ecological education company located at the north entrance to Yellowstone National Park. Our company sponsors educational programs and research in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We also host this free lecture series, A Gathering of Naturalists, which highlights the knowledge and expertise of those who live, study, and love the ecosystem. Now, please join us for our program. A look at Wolverines here, the rare one, devil bear. Let's see if we can cut this down a little bit right here and move it also. Okay, the skunk bear, the glutton, the evil one. Hey, folks, this is just simply a case of bad PR. Wolverines, they're really quite the creature. And tonight we're going to go into the real Wolverines and what a real Wolverine's all about. Because I think they're one of the neatest weasels out there. They just happen to be a big one. But you go to classic books like Carcajou, which talks about the devil bear and so on. You get all this bad PR. Let's take a look a little bit more of the PR on the good side of the Wolverine. And I want to start you out tonight with Peter Krotz's book called Demon of the North. Now, Peter did his PhD on Wolverine, and he raised his own babies from the day they were born till they were 5 years of age in the house with his free roaming Wolverines in the house. Here's Peter with one of his Wolverines. Now, Peter worked in Scandinavia, and they went in and dug the Wolverine kits out of the dens. Here's some kits here, and started raising them. In Scandinavia, this animal is known as the tupu, Tupu, and here's one of his little Wolverines playing with his son Martin's toys. And the Wolverines were climbers, one up on the ladder. And early on, they started playing with the Wolverines and having them out. So they started to put them on leashes and started walking with them, train them to walk with them. And it didn't take very long till the Wolverines didn't need a leash. They would just go wherever Peter and his son went or his wife went. And well, there's one of the Wolverines playing with his son. Now, Wolverines by nature sound gruff and growly, but that's just the way they communicate. This Wolverine's called Juka, and he's playing with Martin, although Martin doesn't seem as satisfied with this relationship. And this one looks dangerous, but it's just some play with the daughter. And here's his wife getting a loving caress from the Wolverine, but doesn't do any damage there. Closer to home, I want to introduce you to an incredible woman. Her name's Lois Chrysler. Lois and her husband worked for Disney starting about 1950 on the North Slopes of Alaska. And they were wildlife photographers for Disney. And her husband went out to follow the caribou herds. Well, the natives had brought in Wolverines that they captured, and Lois and her husband had them in cages there. And Lois had been feeding them through the wires of the cage. And after her husband left one day, she decided she was going to open the door of the cage and see what happened. But she wrote her husband a note first and says, if you come back and find me dead, it's not the Wolverine's fault. I opened the door. And she opened the door, and he peered out at her. Then he came out, and he walked all the way around her cautiously. Then came over and ate out of her hands. Well, now, Lois and her husband ended up with the Disney gig all done, returned to Colorado, and her book of her Arctic adventures was called Arctic Wild. But when she returned to Colorado, she wrote another book in Colorado, and that book details when her husband returned with her, they brought the wolf pack that they had in Alaska to central Colorado. And then they fell on hard times, got divorced, and they turned that wolf pack loose in Colorado. And that was their first reintroduction of wolves back in Colorado. And historically, when I was working down in Colorado on Wolverine, I documented the records of the wolves they turned loose, and they eventually all died off. They didn't have anyone to mate with. Well, Wolverine are members of the weasel family, going from the smallest little weasel, got 3 species of those, and they, of course, turn white in the wintertime in the north, up to the marten, and the marten is a beautiful animal, curious as can be, and they have an orange chest. And then we go up to the badger, a little bit bigger than marten, ground dweller. He kind of looks mean too, but they also make good pets, just as Wolverine do, and both Wolverine and badgers are quite trainable. And then we've got the Wolverine, the biggest land member of the family. This is one Wolverine. Shot this photograph on a Wolverine reintroduction in Colorado. I'll get back to that later on. But that doesn't look like a devil bear, does it? I mean, cute. Wolverines, we've collected over 700 weights, those of us that work on the Wolverines. The largest one we've ever found is 37 pounds, and that was one out of Audrey McGowan's PhD study in Alaska. I've got a picture of Audrey with the Wolverine in her lap, and it looks like it's just this monstrous looking thing, but they're more hair. The gentleman you see on the left there is Howard Hash, and he did the first serious Wolverine studies in the continental United States. Howard radio collared 4 Wolverines in Montana, the first 4 radio collared in the lower 48 was his work. But the heaviest weight we've got on any of them is 37 pounds. You pick up the old Peterson's mammal field guide and it says 80 pounds. And you hear all these stories. Well, 30-pound Wolverine is a mighty big creature. They just don't get that big. This is Wolverine out of Colorado on that reintroduction I was telling you about. But here's Audrey with 2 of her Wolverines. And what I want you to do is compare right here. The one on the left is the classic thing we think of as a Wolverine, a dark animal, blonde stripes on its rump, blonde on the head, blonde ear tips. And that's what you kind of expect. The Wolverine can vary dramatically in color. In fact, they're one of the most variable colored animals there are in the wild. Audrey's here look more like blonde animals. And you see her playing with a antenna on her animal. This is a dark Wolverine. This one was one of 3 in Colorado Springs Zoo many years ago that got loose and ran around Colorado for a while. You still see a little remnants of blonde on the ears and the chest and some blondish claws, but up here on the back, you hardly see any coloration. This is a set of 4 Wolverine skins I put together down at the Denver Museum of Natural History to show variation from an animal that people see and they'd call it blonde to one with maybe some stripes to a black. And I've worked extensively with the largest fur sales operation in the continental United States in Wisconsin. And I put together this slide of the Wolverines in Wisconsin or at the sales. Now, people don't realize the magnitude of fur sales that still go on in the United States. The Wisconsin auction, first auction, midwinter each year is about 2 million furs. And the second one is about 1.25 million furs sold each year at the auction. And they do get in Wolverine. Montana was the last state, I'll come back to this, where Wolverine were legally trapped in the lower 48. So Wolverine are sparser coming in now. The big trade in Wolverine furs is from the game farms and the photographers who pay big money to get pictures of Wolverines. The game farm up by Livingston here, their Wolverines were $300 a photographer an hour to photograph. And so when those animals pass on for some reason, they often go into the auction block. But take a look from black up here in the upper left to these that are strikingly blonde down here. Variability is very high. The Wolverine skull is a massive thing. The one here in the center, that's a marten skull. Here's a Wolverine skull with a telltale story. If you read clues, you see that hole there, that's a 22 shell. That means this Wolverine was trapped and the trapper put it out of its misery with a 22. And the teeth pattern on the Wolverine is very diagnostic. This molar here has one set off at a 90-degree angle that's figure 8 shaped. And this tooth alone will identify the Wolverine if we find it. And I'll come back to Wolverine skulls here in Yellowstone in a little while. But the teeth are crowded together, often displaced. See this one over here. But they're very powerful. If you look at the same side tooth on a wolf, it would be narrow, relatively speaking. On a cat, it would be narrow, not this massiveness for breaking through big bones. They're five-toed animals. You got to look close, but you see 1, 2, 3, 4. Right there is the little toe in the center. And so up here you see 1, 2, 3, 4, and the fifth toe. Um, the when I have people with me and they get on their first Wolverine, the response is always just universal. Wow, that's a big track. Well, this is a 6-inch ruler here, and look at the width of that in reference to its length. This set of tracks here is following um, our snowmobile tracks on a study with Dr. Jeff Copeland out of Idaho. And what you see running alongside it is a coyote track. We intuitively have a feeling for four-toed animals. We grew up with dogs and cats, and we kind of know how wide a footprint would be. Then if you throw in a fifth toe and evolve the animal to float on snow in snow country, suddenly those tracks are very wide. They have a very characteristic track pattern. There's one, two prints right here and one. So 1 by 2 by 1, 1 by 2 by 1 with big prints relative to the width of the trail. That's a good clue. And here is a track with 1, 2, 3, 4 toes, little toe not showing, but they have a chevron shaped pad in their foot instead of a full pad like a dog or a cat. Well, Wolverines come in all sizes and shapes. This was, I believe, the last Wolverine killed in Colorado. And what I threw this slide in for is to show you they normally think about a big tail, but that's not a very big tail. Now, this particular Wolverine, a fellow shot it. He claimed he shot it a mile across the border from Colorado into Utah. In Utah, the animal was not protected, whereas in Colorado, it was a state endangered species. And he was arrested. The Wolverine was confiscated, and he got an attorney, got his Wolverine back. And I went up when he was arrested. He could not show where he had taken the Wolverine, even though there was snow all over the road. So I went up undercover for the Colorado Division of Wildlife and was able to get in with his friends. And this Wolverine, I believe, came off Green Mountain in Colorado National Monument. Probably the last one shot in Colorado. Well, down in Colorado, I was starting my Wolverine project down there, and I heard that Mark Stauffer, not Marty, Mark Stauffer was filming a movie that would be called Rocky Mountain Reunion. And in the movie, John Denver brought back for reintroduction 7 species of animals that he saw in Alaska and Canada. Well, I was trying to find Wolverine. So I called up Mark and I said, hey, Mark, can you guys not let these things go? And he said, well, sorry, Jim, we've got way too much money in this. We brought him in from Canada. We got to let him go. But you come be part of it and be our advisor on Wolverine. So I went up there, and this was our crew. There were 7 scenes in the movie. And between scenes, we had to carry these 2 Wolverines. It was hideous that day, blizzarding to beat the band. Here's John Denver on the left. This is Ernie Wilkinson. Ernie was supposed to be the trapper that took the last trapper in Colorado. And this young gentleman was a young lad that worked for Ernie. I don't remember his name. And between scenes, we would all pitch in and carry. And John Denver carried his own weight. He was quite the fellow there because it was bad. And if you go to the TV, I think on Amazon Prime, you can look up the movie called Rocky Mountain Reunion. Go to the credits, you'll see I'm in there. But if you watch the movie, John, in the actual scenes, John and the kid have to carry the Wolverine. So John's up front with the cage poles on his shoulders, but he's walking with his butt arched clear forward. If you look at this, you see the side panels here have a very fine mesh, but the ends are about 2 inches square. And that Wolverine kept reaching through the end and trying to get a piece of John's ass. It wasn't real happy. But in the end, last scene, set it down. The doors were spring loaded. John stood on the backside and I pulled the springs. The doors flopped open and the Wolverine took off. And John was singing Rocky Mountain Reunion at the top of his lungs. And then we found out the blizzard had packed the old reel to reel tape recorder full of snow and they didn't get any sound on it.
Oh,
Well, you don't exactly go grab a Wolverine and ask him to come back for a second shot.
no.
And anyway, I tracked the Wolverine for the next couple of years, and we think they had young. I'm pretty sure of that. But then we never found him after about 2 years. Well, the Northern Rocky Mountains up here in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana are the home of the Wolverines, and we have our most information from there. In fact, the best information comes from Montana. And back in 1920s, people felt they were near extinction in Montana, possibly gone. There are a couple of records that indicate they survived in Montana and they survived in Wyoming, and I do believe they were never fully extirpated. In 1940s, the trappers of Montana started getting the first specimens, and at that time, they were required to check them in with game and fish. There may have been animals killed before that, but nobody had to check them in, so we don't know. And by 1953, there were 21 had been captured, and two mammalogists, Newby and Wright, um, conducted a study looking at it and said, well, these animals are coming in from Canada and glacier and moving southeast across Montana. What they're doing is repopulating any remaining Wolverine habitat. Now, I worked with Wright down at Teton Science School. He's one of the grand old mammalogists um, of the days almost of Audubon. He goes back that far. Well, the first reports up to about 1953 were almost all males. And after 53, we started finding some females with young in Montana, documenting them. This map here shows you all the trap records of wolverines trapped in the state, blue dots males, pink dots females. And notice the cluster up here around Yellowstone. There were no records in Yellowstone. Now, I've got one trapper up in Livingston that trapped 30 wolverines, and he could only have one a year. He's documented them all in scrapbooks. He's got a scrapbook with pictures of every one of the 30 animals. And most of these dots here are his. I've got another trapper in West Yellowstone that's trapped 6. And I know of 2 that were taken by trappers here in Gardiner area, Gardiner trappers. And we know about these animals because they had to be checked in. And this set of data, no concentration up here at Glacier, is very important. But to us, we wouldn't have this data if they hadn't have been checked with Montana Fish, Wildlife Parks. Well, let me introduce Lisette Waits. Some of you may remember Lisette. She did her PhD here in the park. She did the DNA of the grizzly bears, and Lisette was the one that showed us that all grizzly bears in Yellowstone come from 4 mothers. And she now is a professor over in Idaho. And Greg, I can't say this well, and I apologize to him, Segalski was her student, and Greg took on the DNA analysis of the wolverines, and he worked on samples across Montana. Regretfully, he didn't have any of the samples down here on the west side of Wyoming, but we'd always considered wolverine to be what we call panmictic, meaning, oh, they run anywhere and they'd run all over the place, and therefore you don't have specific populations. Well, as Greg started looking at it, and all those mapped dots I showed you, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks had samples of skulls and hair he could get DNA out of. And so Greg started looking at these, and he found all sorts of wolverines up here occupied by 1955, and 4 of what we call outlier reports. Then he was able to show that the outliers started to increase through 1964. And then after that, was able to document the structure, the geographic structure of the wolverine in Montana. Okay, let's digress a minute. We'll talk about a little bit of DNA. We got the generic cell here in green, and the nucleus, if you will, the brain of the cell, has the DNA chromosomes in it that we pass on our heritage to the newer generations. And we'll call the DNA in the nucleus nuclear DNA, and both parents have it. But then we have these things called mitochondria. There are all sorts of them in the cell. And the mitochondria pass on only the mother's DNA. How that works is when an egg is fertilized by sperm, the male sperm do not have mitochondria. So only the mother's DNA gets passed on in the eggs. So with mitochondrial DNA, we can track the mother's DNA. With nuclear DNA, we can track that of both animals. Well, what Craig was able to do was show there are 3 distinct populations of subpopulations of wolverine in the state of Montana. As I said, regretfully, he didn't have any of these samples down here that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Well, the little math you can set down and say, um, how many Wolverine might move from one of these subpopulations, the Rocky Mountain front, the Crazy Belts, or the Gallatins, every generation of Wolverine. So that's about every 5 years. And what found out is in 5 years, you could have as many as 2.5 Wolverine on average going Rocky Mountain front to Crazy Belts. 3 to 6 coming down here where we are. This wildlife corridor is much more um, amenable to the Wolverines, but almost none between the crazies and the Gallatin population. That means that the crazy belt population is much more isolated. And we used that information when we started looking at rewriting the trapping laws and wildlife laws for Wolverine in Montana. We'll come back to that in a minute. Well, in the meantime, Boy Scout troop down in Jackson, Wyoming, trapped some Wolverines and put radio collars on them and started following them around. Well, that turns out to be a big money project and a lot of work. And so they asked for help. And the New York Zoological Group stepped in through the Wildlife Conservation Society and instigated a study down here in this portion. And the time I made this slide up, there were 25 radio collared. We actually ended up with about 35 radio collared Wolverines from the southwest corner of Yellowstone down into the Wyoming and Salt River ranges south of Jackson Hole. And what we did was we had a graduate student, and I sit down and work with the graduate student on a thing we call Cybertracker. Now, Louis Liebenberg developed Cybertracker in South Africa. When South Africa closed down their hunting blocks and turned them into national parks, all the old natives that had been guides there were out of business, out of the parks, and they went back to become drains on their villages. They didn't earn money. The villages had to support them. And they put Louis in charge of all these new national parks and said, Louis, now you are to manage the wildlife and the poachers, but we don't have any money for you to do it. Well, Louis recognized the incredible asset in the hunting guides there, but none of them could read nor write. So he got with Justin Stevenson and they invented Cybertracker, which uses handheld computers, the old PDAs. Now you do it on your phone, only it all works on picons, picture icons. And the natives quickly learned to recognize those. Well, how it works is you take your little, nowadays, a phone out, it communicates the satellite. You've got a program that allows you to ask all sorts of biological and ecologically significant questions. Come back from the field, you put it in a cradle, and a minute later, using syncing software, it's in the computer. A minute later, you're putting out maps. Well, Louis hired all these old hunter guides, paid them $1 a day, and suddenly they were the envy of the villages. They could talk to satellites, and the young kids saw this and knew it. And they also had money, they were earning money, and their prestige just went up immensely. And his scientific data and so on was just unbelievable. Well, Louis got me going on that. And so for our graduate student, I wrote the Yellowstone program for Wolverine. And what we did on the Yellowstone program, this is the screens you would see. We would go out with radio collar on the Wildlife Conservation Society group, hit the trail, and then backtrack down the trail so we didn't bother the animal. And we had a graduate student for 2 winters followed the Wolverine that were radio collared in the southwest part of Yellowstone, Grand Teton Park down into the Wyoming and Salt River ranges. Regretfully, he did not finish his thesis, and the data are all sitting there uninterpreted at the moment. This is a very sad thing. Well, the next study that started there was a joint Forest Service Park Service study up here at this end. And this followed up on the lynx project that Carrie Gunther, Carrie Murphy, and I had got funded to study lynx. And we had trained park personnel, law enforcement, and others to do tracking. We had 37 tracking routes through Yellowstone, snow tracking routes in the park, 3 helicopter drop camps in the backcountry, and all of this looking for Wolverine. And started radio collaring and trapping. Actually, there were 5 Wolverine trapped, radio collared in the 2 years the trapping part went on. The goal was to study an area different from the wildlife conservation out here more eastern. And where the project actually worked was this part of the park. We set up live traps on the east entrance, northeast entrance. I'm sorry, east entrance here. Wyoming did these traps, and this was ours. We still have traps up here on the northeast corner, up on Mount Washburn and out here, and started trapping. This is a trap right here. And since we're in the park, we couldn't use resources out of the park. Every one of those logs had to be backpacked in to build a trap. Jeff Copeland was designer of the trap and helped us get this done. And we set these up in the park and trapped in the season when most of the grizzly bears we figured would be inside. So here's a bear or a wolverine in the trap.
Mhm.
I don't know if that sound's going out or not, but he's saying, I'm not happy in here. And here's one of the anesthetized wolverines over on, this one's actually over on the Wildlife Conservation Society study. This is the wolverine down here. This is anesthetized, folks, not this one up here. Weigh them. And when we're trapping, had to have a veterinarian ready. So we kept veterinarian in Silvergate. And on the traps, we put another radio on there. And if the gate went down, the trap door went down, it triggered the radio and the veterinarian would come running right down. And here in the park, we trapped mostly marten and red fox. Did eventually get 5 wolverine and anesthetized them, took samples, hair samples, blood, radio collared them. And here's the trap. Now that trap's actually 4 foot tall. It's deep snow. And here comes the release.
Mm.
There's the characteristic gait that leaves that 1 by 2 by 1 track pattern. He looks back and says, what's going on? And what we learned out of trapping at the Wildlife Conservation Society, Forest Service, and Park Service is some wolverine are trap happy. They're quite happy to come back the trap and get fed again and let you catch them because you let them go and they're content. Well, here's results out of the Forest Service Park Service study. Female 3, male 4, male 1. Female 133, this is one trapped by the Wildlife Conservation Society down here southwest of the park, and male 2. And of course, we got all the radio collar data that shows all sorts of movement. This is female 3 from March of 2007 to July of 2007. And obviously, they do cover a lot of country. And one of the things you'll notice now, this section's on Forest Service, but you see these little sort of half-shaped things. That's where we had the Forest Service traps located. And the Park Service ran out of money to support the project first. The Forest Service kept going another year. But what Kerry did was he took advantage of the fact that wolverine leave tracks that are very characteristic in the snow. I said Kerry, I should say Kerry Gunther did this. I'm sorry, Kerry Murphy did this part of the study. So got some helicopter time, got a little money for helicopter work. We divided the park in half by using squares, and then Kerry flew with the helicopter looking for tracks. And on this particular day, we knew this animal was one of the collared ones and found 2 other wolverine by tracking. And just for some crude type math, you could play around and say, well, if we had 3 and we surveyed half the land, then we ought to have 6 wolverine. And that's sort of a crude minimum estimate. That plus some other stuff indicated to us that we probably at any time in the park didn't have more than 10 wolverine. But the nice thing about this, 2.5 days of flight was only $22,000. And we had the 37 ski routes, helicopter drop camps, 3.5 years of other stuff, and didn't, we got more by helicopter, bottom line, quickly. Well, if you want to find out a little bit about the wolverine, the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS.org, International North America Yellowstone Wolverine. Go look them up on their page and see what they've got there. And the site I would really recommend to you is the Wolverine Foundation. This is Jeff Copeland's site. Jeff, his PhD thesis, the Wolverine, and now he's employed by the Idaho Wildlife Department there. There's a lot of PDFs on there. Jeff often got his hands on PDFs before we could get them anywhere else. And so incredible amount of study information posted here, not only of the United States and Canada, but the Scandinavian countries. Very excellent site to go to. And Forest Service, I'm sorry, Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for Wolverine. And if you go to Region 6, r6.fws for Fish and Wildlife Service.gov, then go to the Species tab, Mammals, Wolverine. You can work your way down and find out the information they've got up on there. Now, there's been some interesting Wolverine stuff. One of the WCS Wolverines, radio collared, went down the north side of the Wind Rivers, down to the Red Desert, around the Red Desert, and into the Snowy Range and down to Rocky Mountain National Park, where it survived for the next couple of years and then has disappeared. We don't know what happened to it, but that made the people in Rocky Mountain National Park really happy to have a Wolverine there. Chuck Snover, and I know a few of you probably know Chuck. He was one of our YF volunteers and a student on my tracking classes. Left the tracking class, went to Glacier, went hiking up the trail, and here's this Wolverine feeding on a bighorn sheep. Well, the Park Service immediately came in, closed the trail down, and so Chuck was basically the only one that got to see it, but he did get a photo for us. That's pretty neat. And about that time, I was training Forest Service and Park Service personnel across the western half of the United States, the Great Lakes, and the Canadian people on finding rare species by tracking. And project got going up in Washington, managed to capture 2 coming down from Canada in 06 and 3 in 07. Katie Moriarty was one of my tracking students here in Yellowstone. And Katie went to California, worked with the California people I'd worked with. On her thesis was on the other weasel, the marten, our little orange-chested friend, and she had out marten scents and lures to attract marten, and lo and behold, look who comes to her camera station. And so they put out hair snags using a type of carpet with nails out and got hair from the Wolverine. Now, this created a big ruckus in California. There was a groups that came out and said California Game and Fish, Cal Fish and Game, I'm sorry, were lying to them that they'd been Wolverine always in California. They were never extinct, and they knew that the Cal Fish and Game might even have introduced them, but Cal Fish and Game was liars. Well, when Katie got the hair and we checked the DNA on it, it came from a population up in northwest Montana. It was one that had moved down from Montana. Well, that brings us to Wolverine trapping. In Montana, it was the last state Wolverine could be trapped. And there was a heavy limit on the trapping of 10 animals. That was the most to be trapped in the state. In the northern section, 5, in the Crazies, 1, in the southern, 4. And in spite of that trapping level, Wolverine had increased in the state of Montana from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s on. And we were able to do the DNA studies from Craig and our other studies by the fact that we had trapped specimens that we could collect DNA from and learn from them and show how the population had increased. But when this came up again for debate in Montana, the scientific community, we sat down and testified. And what happened is we got this changed to a population quota of 5, 3 in the Northwest, 0 in the Crazies. Remember how isolated they were, and 1 down here. And additionally, we had a 1 and 1 over here, the 5th one, sorry, 3, 4, 5. We had also a female quota. And if 1 female was trapped anywhere, the whole season was done for the year. And this went on the internet and the phones. All trappers were responsible for knowing when the season closed. And if they got something, they had 24 hours to get it to Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and onto the internet, unless they were in the back country and it took more than 24 hours to get out. So we dropped that total in 2008 to 5. Since then, managed to stop the wolver trapping now. So now the quotas are 0. They can't trap in the state of Montana anymore. Um, I'm not going to go through in great detail, but we've been involved. I started out originally with with what was called the Forest Carnivore Committee. This was a group of Canadian and American folks who set together with the governments to provide um, detailed studies on wolverine, lynx, fisher, and marten. And so we started battling for protected status, endangered species status, threatened status, whatever we could get for wolverine and lynx way back in the 80s. And by 2000, there was a petition put out by the Biodiversity Legal Fund to get the wolverine listed. Well, we've been defeated several times. 2003, Fish and Wildlife Service said there wasn't substantial information indicated that listing was warranted. One of the main ways you get a species listed is you know a population and you show that the numbers in the population have gone down. Well, so little was known, we couldn't show that the population had decreased. In fact, the data I've just showed you indicated it was increasing in Montana. So we lost that in 2003. 2007, Defenders of Wildlife championed the wolverine and argued that incorrect status had been standards had been used to assess our petition, and that went to federal court. The federal courts ordered that it be reviewed. Took forever and a day, but finally, in 2008 March, they came out and said that the petition does not constitute a liable entity under the act, and so we've not been able to get them listed. This is part of that. The listing was not warranted. So the agencies and the tribes have got together on a conservation strategy, trying to manage wolverine and wolverine habitat in the western states as a joint effort, even though they're not federally listed. I'm not going to go into detail on all the other fights we had there. Let's skip that. Breaking news. And some of you, I'm sure, have got to see this on the internet already. Dan Staler with his Cougar Project had some camera stations out looking for the wolverine. Somebody's got their microphone on. Could you mute it? Because it's giving me feedback. Anyway, watch quickly because here comes a wolverine. There he is. And let's see if we can get this to rerun now that you know what to expect. There he comes. There you go. You can see good classic dark wolverines, blonde sides. Try it one more time. There he is. Obviously a little bit of light catching it in the eyes, some night glow there. Very good. Well, this is Mammoth, and this is up at the beaver ponds, and this is where the animal was photographed. This is sagebrush country, folks. Look at that. He was obviously on the drainage, might be a good corridor. There's Gardiner. So if you look up Gardiner, you look up just about to exactly where he's at. Well, let me put that in a little bit of perspective. Here are some other wolverines. This is the one on the video this year. This wolverine right here, Norm Bishop's on here, and this is a wolverine that Norm got in 1994, and it was up on Snow Pass. Norm was able to photograph outstanding footprints in the snow when he was skiing up there, and Norm still does all that skiing. But again, near the sagebrush country, not that much conifer area where we might expect him. This wolverine skull over here was collected. I didn't look up the date. I think we're about 6 years ago. And this is on the trail from Blacktail Ponds out to Rescue Creek. It's up on the plateau. But it's out, this is all sagebrush, folks, out here, totally sagebrush. And that skull was brought out. They brought it to me, and oh yeah, that's a wolverine skull for sure. And so these are three very interesting ones because we've got them out in sagebrush country when we normally think of this as an animal largely of the high forests into the alpine regions at tree line, upper tree line, but they'll go wherever they've got carcasses to feed on, and that means wintering elk and deer. Now, this one, breaking news. Chad Meadows up in Cook City on October 27th got this photograph. And he was out at about 7:30 in the morning walking his dog in Cook City. So Chad runs the Alpine Motel. And right here, you see this blue arrow. Chad came out here and the Wolverine was coming towards him, and he shot the picture looking back that way. I went up and investigated. There was snow on the ground, although it was real hot and melting. So it was pretty poor tracking, but I was able to follow the Wolverine down here. He made a loop and went over and down here. And this had all pretty well melted out, but there was a dog food bowl here that was empty. And I couldn't tell for sure if he had got to that bowl or not, but he was close. Then he came back over on the north side of the buildings into deep snow again and came down here. He made two loops there, came down, and this was melted out, so we couldn't tell what he did. Came back, went to the road, backtracked to here, and then exited out the north side up the south facing mountain. And this was bad tracking here. I could have tracked farther. Um, uh, Audra Conkle was helping me track there. We could have gone farther, but it was, it was down to where it was very slow trying to follow him and had to give up that day. Here's the main road through Cook City, crossed here at the bottom of the slide. Nothing in the tracking indicated that this animal was in any great hurry. He seemed to be exploring around. Um, and it was all done in the daytime after 7:30 in the morning. So certainly there must have been sounds of the town and at least waking up and so on as the animal headed out. So that's kind of the recent stuff on Wolverine. Each winter, we pick up one or two good Wolverine reports and got a little catalog of the reports. But this winter has started out real good for us with two uh, positive documentations by photographs or video and not just counting on tracks.